Today, we will be honing our rendezvous skills with the contract, Rescue a Kerbal from orbit of Kerbin. In fact, we will be performing 2 rescues with the same vessel. Our 2 rescuees are in very similar orbits, providing the opportunity for us to explore the best techniques for moving from one location to another in the same orbit. Also, as our Kerbals will need to EVA from one vessel to the other, we will be taking a close look at the control scheme for their EVA packs. Let's get started. And we'll start by taking a look at our contracts. There are these 2 here, Rescue Jared S from orbit of Kerbin and Rescue Banditu from orbit from Kerbin, and they're both very much the same. Let's go over the objectives for each. Rescue Jared S. Kerbin, who is stranded in low orbit. Return her safely to Kerbin. And you can see the payouts and all of that kind of thing. Not only do you get cash for doing this, you get the Kerbal. After you have successfully rescued Jared, Jared becomes part of your Kerbinaut core, which is awesome because normally it costs you money to hire these Kerbals if you did this through the astronaut complex. This one, you get not only her for free, you actually get paid for going to get her. So always in these career games, don't hire your Kerbals, rescue them. You'll build up your Kerbinaut core very, very quickly. One word I do want to draw attention to here is the low Kerbin orbit part. You can get contracts that don't say the low part. Low, I find they're almost always in around 80 kilometers in altitude in equatorial circular orbits. So in other words, pretty easy to get to. If it doesn't say low, these orbits can be all over the place, and you do get rescues around other bodies as well. So be on the lookout. You don't want to pick one up thinking it's going to be easy and then find out it's a little more challenging than what you thought. And if we go over here to Banditu, we can see Banditu is, it says all the same thing, including the low Kerbin orbit part. So these 2 rescues are very similar to each other. But that brings up another interesting problem. Let's go over to the tracking station and take a close look at our orbits. So here are our 2 rescuees. We have Banditu in this orbit down here, and we have Jared in this orbit. And you can see that they're very similar. They're not quite the same orbit. Let's see, if I click on one of them, it actually gives you, let's see, Jared is in an orbit with an apoapsis of 90 kilometers and a periapsis of 80, while Banditu is in an orbit with an apoapsis of 80 and a periapsis of 79, a tad bit lower. We know how to do a rendezvous. We talked about that in a previous video. But once I've rescued one of them, how do I get from that Kerbal to the other Kerbal? And which Kerbal should I rescue first? Those are the questions we're going to be getting into, well, right now. And yeah, we're not going to be going into the VAB to do any building because this is a vessel you have seen before. It was used first to ferry tourists, and it was used again in our first basic rendezvous video, and we're just going to simply use it straight up again. So let's get into map view, and here we are, and here are our 2 Kerbals, Jared and Banditu. And the thing is who do we want to rescue first? And it does make a difference, and both of them have their advantages. So in this video, I'm going to do both, and then you can decide in your situation which way you would most prefer to do it. I'm going to rescue one of them, and we've done a rendezvous before, and it's going to be exactly the same as our previous rendezvous video, so I don't need to go over that in detail. But once I have gotten to one of them, I will then be at them in their orbit. Then I need to get from their location to the other location, whichever way I decide to do it. And that's what this video is really going to be about, is how do we go about doing that? Well, we do that by either speeding ourselves up or slowing ourselves down. If I was in Jared's position, I would want to slow myself down so I will end up back at Banditu's position. And if I was in Banditu's position, I would want to speed myself up to get to Jared's position. To speed yourself up, you need to lower the altitude of your orbit. To slow yourself down, you need to increase the altitude of your orbit. And here's where a bit of the rub comes in. Because we're in low orbit about Kerbin, we're only in an altitude here of about 80 kilometers. We can't come down that far before we start coming into the atmosphere. So our ability to speed up by lowering the altitude of our orbit is rather limited. However, we have all of space above us to increase our altitude and slow ourselves down. So one way to look at this is to go for the one that's further ahead in their orbit, and that would be Jared. So we're going to do this first by going to Jared, but then I'm going to do it a second time going to Benditu first, and I'll show you there's an advantage to doing it that way too, though it is a tad bit more involved. All right, getting to Jared. Now, remember with our rendezvous video, in order to rendezvous, you need to put yourself into an orbit that's initially different from your target orbit. So we'll set Jared as a target. Thing is, Jared's in an orbit of what? His current altitude is 87 kilometers. Periapsis is 80 kilometers. Remember, the atmosphere is at 70 kilometers. There's not a lot of room below his orbit. So we're going to go above his orbit. If we go above his orbit, we're going to be going slower. So what we're going to want to do is put ourselves ahead of Jared so that he will catch up to us. He will be the target will be faster than we are. If we are going into an orbit below Jared, then we would want to be behind him, and then we would be the faster one and catch up. But there's just not that much room below, so we're going to go above and we're going to go ahead. And to be honest, looking at the situation right now, I think it looks pretty good. So we're just going to launch immediately. And as I've already done a basic rendezvous video, I'm not going to repeat all that here. If you need a hand with that, go back and check that video out. But I will point out the differences here. Number one is I inserted myself into a 100 kilometer circular orbit, a little bit higher than the target's orbit. I then needed to set up my drift burn, but this time, now that we're in the higher orbit, that drift burn needs to be a retrograde burn. Got my closest approach distance as small as I could, performed the burn, and then when I got to within about 2 minutes or so of the target, I reduced that closest approach distance even further, and then began slowly reducing my relative velocity to the target until the point that relative velocity was 0 when I was right alongside the target. 3, 2, and 0. There we go. Okay, so what we're going to need to do is we're going to EVA Jared here over to our capsule, and we're going to want to facilitate this a little bit. Now, one thing that I find really helps is I put this onto, if I'm in an equatorial orbit, onto the north direction and right on the horizon, and then I pay attention to where the hatch is, and I roll the craft so that the hatch is pointing towards where our EVA Kerbal is going to come from. This will help getting him over there. And then we're going to hit the square bracket, and we're going to come over here to Jared, and we're going to find out who Jared is. And Jared is a scientist. Excellent. So we picked up a scientist, and we're going to EVA Jared. And then we're going to let go by hitting the space bar. And then we're going to turn on our jetpack using RCS. And why don't we take a little bit of time to talk about how the jetpack here works. Here, put her lights on too. Okay, so basic controls for the jetpack. We have the WASD controls. So W pushes you forward. Noticing the texture is a little messed up. She has a science kit for some reason. And the S key moves you backwards. Now, one thing to notice is as I move forwards and backwards, she always spins in the direction that you have the camera pointing. So if I push W here to go forward, she goes forward. She spins in that direction. That is the default sort of behavior. You can toggle that on and off by toggling on and off SAS. So for instance, if I turn off SAS by pressing T and now I press W, right? Notice that it doesn't move her that way, or if I press back, right? She stays oriented the way she is oriented. Personally, I think most people find it easier to keep SAS on so that she always points in the direction you have the camera facing. I'm noticing I'm above the capsule, so I need to go down. To go down, I need to push the left control key. To go up, it is the left shift key. To go to the left is the A key, and to go to the right is the D key. Now, what I would recommend that you do, honestly, the first time you EVA, is just spend some time practicing with this. Again, W forward, S backwards, A to the left, D to the right, shift to go up, left shift, and left control to go down. Do pay attention to your resources. Your EVA propellant is limited, and if she runs out, then she can no longer do any of this kind of stuff. But just sort of practice going around your capsule like this, right? So I'm doing W, and I've done obviously a lot of this, so, you know, I'm getting a little bit better. You know, a few hundred hours of doing this probably gets you pretty good at it. But if you are, you know, just do this, just practice. There's no, you know, we're not going anywhere. So why take your time trying to figure this stuff out? Now, one thing to also, another tip is I want to get to the hatch, but notice how the hatch is a little bit wacky in its orientation. I'm kind of coming at it at an angle. You can change your views by pressing the V key, just like you can with a ship. So if I press V, I'm now in orbital view, and now if I press W to move forward, look at how nicely oriented she is with the capsule. So play around with the different views, because quite often they can help as well. Okay, let's get ourselves to the capsule so I can see I need to go forward, but the best thing to do is put the capsule, aim your camera where you want to go, and then she'll go that way. I want to go that way, so just go that way. Don't go too quick. You might want to slow down a little bit with the S key. I think my height's pretty good. So we'll just come in, maybe come down a little bit. And as you get closer, you will suddenly see F to grab. And bam, grab. Then she grabs and then she goes. Now the problem is if I try to board with B, well, Valentina is kind of in the way. She is in this capsule, and it's a one crew capsule. I can put two crew down in this lower section, but this lower section doesn't have a hatch. So in order to get Jared in, what I need to do is press the bracket key to get back to my ship, and to right click on the capsule and hit transfer crew, and I can transfer Valentina to this other capsule. There we go. And now I can hit the square bracket key again a couple times. You can cycle both ways, by the way, with the square bracket keys. Now she's able to board. Now notice, even though I have a scientist in the capsule now, I actually do have my piloting skills. I got my lock to prograde and lock to retrograde from Valentina. Even though she's not in the pilot seat, so to speak. Now what's interesting is if I take the scientist out, if we transfer the scientist back, let's transfer crew back to the capsule here. Now there's nobody in the and now I don't have my SAS control. So it's like you don't need the pilot to actually be in the pilot seat. As long as there's a Kerbal in the pilot seat and a pilot on board, you get your piloting skills. Let's go get Bandito. So we'll set Bandito as a target. Now Bandito is behind us, so we need to slow ourselves down so he can catch up to us. And we slow ourselves down by raising the altitude of our orbit. So I'm going to add a maneuver here. Now this can get a little bit messed up sometimes. I'll move the maneuver so it's just a little bit ahead of me. And let's see here. There. Okay. Let's turn this one off. Let's take a look at our separation. Oh, it's a little bit... Let's burn this so we can see it. There we go. Separation of 820. And as I burn prograde, that should be coming down. But it can see that it's not. And in fact, what ends up happening is it pauses to the point where it's not changing at all, no matter how much you burn. Now, this should definitely be getting us a rendezvous. It's getting a little bit confused because our burn is ahead of this. And what you need to do is move the burn so that it is on the other side of this close encounter indicator. Now, as I move this, this also moves. So it's really messed up right now. So the way to get this, if you find this is happening, is instead of putting the maneuver just ahead of you, is to go all the way over to where the other close encounter indicator is, go past that, put a maneuver there, and now as I burn prograde, I should be finding that that distance is right on that period. Oh, there's a lot of icons there. There's our distance, 478 I should find now that that distance is actually going down. So you can see here a prograde burn is bringing down my closest separation. And I can bring it down now as low as I want. Just like that. Okay, about 1.7 kilometers. So you can see here that 121 meter per second burn will put us into this orbit, which is a higher altitude. That's slowing us down so that we will come around and meet back up with Banditu when we come back down here towards our periapsis. Now be careful, this isn't the only cost of this. It's 121 meters per second to put us into this orbit, but also if we take a look at our close encounter indicator, our relative speed right here when we meet up with Banditu is 125 meters per second, and we're going to have to get that down to 0. So that's going to cost us 125 meters per second of delta V. So adding those two together, we're looking at close to about 250 meters per second of delta V to do this rendezvous. We do have enough. If you look, I have 572, so I am fine. But in the second half of this, I'll show you a trick that you can actually use to bring this down even further. But for now, let's do exactly this. This burn's coming up in just 8 minutes. And it's about a 7-second burn. So what we're going to do is we're going to wait to, we're about 7 seconds from the burn, and then we'll go to half throttle. I find I just have a little bit better control doing that. Okay, here we go. And again, more than watching a maneuver node, what I'm really watching is this intersect distance. It's slowing down. It gets very fine here, very quick at the end. Okay, so 40, 30, 20, 10 separation. Oh, and it started to go back up there, right there at the end. So I overcooked it a little bit. So what we're going to do is we're going to get rid of the maneuver. We're going to turn our thrust limiter way down because it's very fine adjustments. Flip this around to retrograde, and we'll do a correction for this. There's no rush. You can take your time, little tiny burns. Let's see how low we can get this. So 3 kilometers. 2 kilometers, 4, oh, it's starting to go back up. Okay, 1.46, that's fine. Okay, and we'll get ourselves ready to get out there. We're going to meet up in about 37 minutes. And now you can really see what's going on. We're going into this blue orbit, but our altitude is increasing, which means our velocity is going to go down, and we're timing this in such a way so that when we get back here towards periapsis, we're going to be meeting up with Banditu. But let's cut the time warp here for a second. We got 125 meters per second with a relative velocity of our target that we have to kill off. And that's quite a lot, especially compared to the rendezvous we've done thus far. And what a lot of people like to do to match velocities with the target is instead of using the data that's down there at the bottom left like I've been doing thus far, but to use a maneuver node there instead. So we can add a maneuver right here where the encounter is, add the maneuver. I know my relative speed at the encounter is 125.1 meters per second. So what I need to do is I need to knock that off, and I can see from my orbit that I need to actually bring my orbit back down, because that's what's happening when you match velocities with your target, is you're actually also matching that target's orbit. So why don't we just go over to our little widgety tool here and put in that relative velocity of negative 125.1 meters per second and see what that does for us. So you can see what's going on here is we've taken down our orbit. We're now matching our target's orbit, but also we have changed this encounter indicator. Our closest approach is 1.4 kilometers, and our relative velocity at that closest approach is 2.3 meters per second. Now, if you want to, you can go back, select the maneuver, select the widgety tool, play around with it if you want to see if that can be made a little bit better. Yeah, see, I can see that's going to be closer there. I actually want to have a little bit more relative. Let's do it that one. Let's do this one. So this is actually just a burn of 121.9 kilometers. That will leave us with a closest approach of 1.3 kilometers, 3.6 meters per second. All right, and now we're just going to do that burn rather than the looking at the intercept tools. Okay, and 8, and let's go half throttle. There we go. So slowing down, looking at our closest approach distance. We're Starting to push that time to intercept down, and we're almost... Oh, there. Okay, I'm stopping. I noticed this time was starting to go back up. I don't want that to happen. And I am still approaching it because the time is going down. Then if you start seeing this time starting to go up, that means something's gone wrong. But our closest approach is now 760 meters. All right, let's get down there. And whether you like to do this using a rendezvous or whether you like to do this using just the tools down there in the bottom left like I did in the previous rendezvous video, that's completely up to you. Maybe in some circumstances you might want to do it one way. In some circumstances with higher velocities you might want to use the maneuver node. But you're not going to find out until you practice both ways yourself and find out what works for you. But I think it's time for us to meet our newest Kerbal, who is a scientist as well. All right, let's get him over. Whoa, this one's a wild ride. And of course, once Bandito is aboard, the only thing that's left is to bring these folks back down to the surface to satisfy the conditions of the contract. But instead of doing that, why don't I back up and look at how I could do this if I had rescued Bandito first. So with Bandito aboard, we now have to go get Jared. Jared, of course, is now ahead of us in our orbit. I would love to speed myself up, but remember, to speed myself up, I need to lower the altitude of my orbit, and that's going to end up putting me into the atmosphere, so that is not going to work. But we can still use the same trick we used before by increasing the altitude of our orbit and slowing us down. It just means that Jared is going to have to take the long way around Kerbin before he eventually meets up with us, which means we're going to have to slow ourselves down even more, and that means a bigger burn. And in fact, this burn came out to be 350 meters per second. And don't forget, I also have to consider my encounter velocity when we get down to our rendezvous, and that comes out to be 348 meters per second. So this whole maneuver is going to cost me around 700 meters per second. And if we take a look down here at the bottom left, I only have 482 meters per second left in the vehicle. So this isn't going to work. But don't worry, there is a way to cut this cost down dramatically. And by the way, this technique would have worked with my previous rendezvous, so if you want to cut that one down, you can do that as well. Now, our closest approach distance is 733 kilometers. We are pretty far apart, but you may recall we are in a lower orbit, so we are very slowly catching up to Jared. Let's take advantage of that. I'm going to put a maneuver over here. I'm going to add a maneuver just in front of us. But instead of putting in a bunch of prograde like I did before, what I'm instead going to do, I'm going to go down here to the little widgety tool, and I'm going to pop ahead in orbit. And notice that this separation went down. That's because we just sped up. We're catching up to him. Let's pop ahead another orbit. And another, and another. And we're going to keep doing that. And notice how this separation is coming down without us putting in any fuel required, no delta V at all. This is all happening for free. All we have to do is wait. Catching up, catching up, catching up. And now all of a sudden we are 9.6 kilometers separation. How can we make this back down to 0? Well, all I got to do is take this maneuver and tweak it a little bit. Add a little bit of prograde, a little bit of retrograde. Let's see here. A little bit of prograde here. Oh, prograde's bringing it down further. So we're getting some nice separation here. 1 kilometer, 0.8. Oh, 0.8 seems to be about as low. You can also play with the timing a little bit. Moving it around. Well, oh yeah, look at that. 0.6. Okay, so we're getting it there. And with, look at that, a 1.7 meter per second burn. So if we just wait a day and an hour and do this 1.7 meter per second burn, it's a tiny little burn to get our encounter rather than the big one. And also our relative speed at our encounter here is only 6.2 meters per second. So it's only going to be about 2 plus another 6, 8 meters per second to do the entire rendezvous. All right, let's do it. And while Valentina tracks down Jared, why don't I take this opportunity to take a look at the main takeaways from this episode? I spent a bit of time talking about EVA controls. If you are struggling with this, my advice would be to quick save and just practice flying around your vessel until you are comfortable with the controls. Our big topic was how to move between 2 points in similar orbits, the main idea being to raise or lower the altitude of your orbit, thus adjusting your speed and allowing the two vessels to come together after one more orbit. This can be made significantly cheaper by moving the maneuver node ahead a number of orbits to allow the vessels to come closer together naturally. And with that, I'm going to be drawing this episode to a close. Next week, we'll be getting started with our first space station. I hope to see you then.